By late 1944, many Japanese military planners believed that Tokyo was effectively beyond the reach of sustained American fighter operations. The Pacific Ocean had long acted as a strategic buffer, and although bombing raids had begun to appear, escort fighters capable of operating deep over the Japanese homeland were considered unlikely to maintain a persistent presence. Japanese air defense doctrine assumed that distance, fuel limits, and logistical constraints would prevent American fighters from regularly appearing over the capital. In this calculation, bombers might arrive, but the skies above Tokyo would still largely belong to Japan's own interceptors once those bombers crossed the final stretch of ocean. This assumption shaped defensive planning, aircraft deployment, and the confidence of pilots responsible for protecting the homeland. Yet the strategic balance in the air war was already shifting. Advances in long-range fighter capability, combined with the capture of forward island bases across the Pacific, were quietly removing the geographic barriers that had once protected Japan's major cities. When American fighters finally began appearing over Tokyo, it was not simply another air raid. It was evidence that the defensive distance Japan relied upon had collapsed. The arrival of escort fighters over the capital meant that bombing formations could now operate with protection deep inside Japanese airspace, transforming the nature of the aerial battle above the country. What had once been considered a secure defensive perimeter was suddenly exposed, and the skies over Tokyo became part of a much larger and rapidly changing strategic contest. For much of the early Pacific War, Japan's belief that Tokyo was relatively safe from sustained fighter presence was not based on overconfidence alone. It was grounded in geography and the technological limits of aircraft at the time. The distance between American-controlled territory and the Japanese home islands created a natural barrier that made continuous fighter operations extremely difficult. Early in the war, the United States did not possess large numbers of fighters capable of traveling the vast distances required to reach Tokyo, conduct combat operations, and return safely. Most fighters had operational ranges between 500 and 700 miles under combat conditions, far too short to escort bombers across the Pacific and back. Even when long-range bombers, such as the B-29 Superfortress, began appearing later in the war, then the assumption within Japanese planning circles was that escort fighters would still struggle to accompany them all the way to the capital. Without fighter escort, bombers were expected to face interceptors alone once they entered Japanese airspace. Japanese air defense planning relied heavily on this assumption. The Homeland Defense Network was built around radar stations, interceptor airfields, and anti-aircraft units positioned to engage incoming bomber formations. The expectation was that Japanese fighter units would intercept bombers after they crossed the outer defense perimeter, using speed and altitude advantage to break up formations before they reached key industrial and urban targets. This doctrine had worked in earlier phases of the war when enemy aircraft operated closer to their own bases and could not sustain long-range fighter coverage. In those conditions, defending forces often held the advantage once attackers entered national airspace. Fuel limitations reinforced this belief. Long-range escort operations require enormous amounts of fuel, not just for the bombers themselves, but also for the fighters protecting them. Carrying additional fuel typically meant using external drop tanks, which could affect aircraft performance and maneuverability. Japanese planners assumed that even if American fighters attempted such missions, they would arrive over Tokyo with reduced endurance, limiting their ability to remain in combat for extended periods. In theory, this meant Japanese interceptors could wait until the escorts were forced to withdraw before launching aggressive attacks against bomber formations. There was also a psychological factor involved. Japan had built its defensive expectations on the idea that distance still provided a form of strategic protection. Throughout much of history, the capitals located deep inside national territory had been difficult for enemies to reach regularly. The Pacific Ocean appeared to serve the same role for Tokyo. While bombing raids were possible, the belief remained that sustained fighter coverage over the capital was unlikely. This assumption shaped how Japanese commanders evaluated the threat posed by American air operations. When fighters eventually began appearing alongside bombers over the Japanese homeland, they get challenged not just a tactical expectation, but a central pillar of Japan's defensive strategy in the air war. The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo did not happen suddenly or by accident. It was the result of a gradual technological and logistical shift that had been building throughout the later stages of the Pacific War. One of the most important elements in this shift was the development and large-scale deployment of long-range escort fighters capable of operating far beyond the limits of earlier aircraft. Early in the war, most fighter designs were built primarily for short-range interception or tactical battlefield support. They were effective near friendly airfields, but lacked the fuel capacity required for sustained operations across the vast distances of the Pacific. As American planners began preparing for strategic bombing campaigns against the Japanese home islands, it became clear that bomber formations would need reliable fighter protection deep inside enemy airspace. The solution involved combining several advances rather than relying on a single innovation. One key factor was the refinement of high-performance long-range fighters, such as the P-51 Mustang. Although the aircraft itself was originally designed for operations in the European theater, its aerodynamic efficiency and fuel capacity made it adaptable for extremely long missions when equipped with external drop tanks. These detachable fuel tanks allowed fighters to carry additional fuel during the long approach to a target area. Once the fuel in the tanks was consumed, the tanks could be released, allowing the fighter to regain full maneuverability for combat. This simple but highly effective system dramatically increased the operational range of escort fighters. Equally important was the capture of forward island bases across the Pacific. Beginning with campaigns in the Central Pacific and the Mariana Islands, American forces gradually established airfields closer to the Japanese homeland. Bases on islands such as Saipan, Tinian, and Guam provided staging areas for long-range bombing missions conducted by B-29 bombers. More importantly, these bases also reduced the distance fighters needed to travel in order to escort those bombers. What had once been an impossible range problem became a manageable operational challenge when aircraft no longer had to cross the entire Pacific in a single mission. Navigation and fuel management techniques also improved. Long-distance missions required precise coordination between bombers, escort fighters, and support aircraft. Pilots had to maintain strict formation discipline while managing fuel consumption over several hours of flight. American air units increasingly developed standardized procedures for these missions, allowing fighters to escort bombers for large portions of the journey while still retaining enough fuel to return safely. As these systems matured, the idea that fighters could not appear regularly over Tokyo began to collapse. The result was a transformation in how air operations could be conducted against Japan. Bombers no longer had to enter Japanese airspace alone. With long-range escort fighters now capable of accompanying them deep into the homeland, American air formations gained both protection and offensive flexibility. When these fighters finally began appearing above Tokyo, alongside bomber formations, they represented the culmination of technological adaptation, forward base expansion, and logistical planning that had steadily eroded the geographic protection Japan had once relied upon. The arrival of American fighters over Tokyo was not simply the result of longer aircraft range. It depended on a coordinated system that linked long-range bombers, escort fighters, fuel planning, and carefully organized flight routes across the Pacific. Strategic bombing missions against Japan were built around the B-29 Superfortress, a bomber capable of flying thousands of miles while carrying heavy bomb loads at high altitude. However, the B-29's ability to reach Japanese cities created a new challenge. Once inside Japanese airspace, the bombers still needed protection from intercepting fighters. Escort aircraft had to remain close enough to defend the formation while still conserving enough fuel to complete the long return journey. To solve this, American planners designed missions that carefully balanced distance, fuel consumption, and combat endurance. The escort fighters, such as the P-51, were launched from island bases in the Mariana Islands, often taking off shortly after the bomber formations had already departed. Using external drop tanks, the fighters carried large additional fuel reserves during the long outbound flight. These tanks allowed them to travel extended distances without sacrificing the performance needed for combat later in the mission. Once the fuel in the drop tanks was consumed, pilots could release them, though reducing weight and drag before entering contested airspace. Timing and altitude were also critical. Bomber formations typically flew at altitudes around 25,000 to 30,000 feet during the long approach to Japan. Escort fighters would rendezvous with them before reaching the most heavily defended areas. Once joined, the fighters spread out above and around the bomber formations, creating a protective screen designed to intercept incoming Japanese aircraft before they could reach the bombers. This protective pattern meant that Japanese interceptors now had to fight through escort fighters before engaging the bombers themselves. The system also relied heavily on precise navigation across vast stretches of open ocean. Pilots had to follow carefully planned routes to ensure that fighters and bombers met at the correct points before reaching Japan. The radio communication and coordinated timing allowed different squadrons to synchronize their movements, despite the enormous distances involved. Even small errors in timing or fuel calculation could have serious consequences, making mission planning a complex logistical exercise. Once over Japan, the presence of escort fighters fundamentally changed the dynamics of air combat. Instead of facing bomber formations operating alone, Japanese defenders now encountered coordinated formations with fighter protection capable of engaging interceptors directly. The escort system extended the defensive reach of the bombers and allowed American air units to maintain pressure over the Japanese homeland in ways that had previously been impossible. The skies above Tokyo were no longer just a battlefield for bombers and interceptors. They had become a contested zone where long-range fighters could actively shape the fight. When American fighters finally began appearing over the skies near Tokyo, the initial encounters unfolded in ways that many Japanese pilots had not fully anticipated. Japanese air defense had long been organized around the expectation that incoming threats would consist primarily of bomber formations approaching at high altitude. Interceptor units were trained to climb rapidly, engage the bombers directly, and attempt to disrupt the formation before bombs could be released. This doctrine assumed that defending fighters would be able to focus entirely on attacking the bombers themselves. The sudden appearance of long-range American escort fighters changed that dynamic in a dramatic and immediate way. During some of the first missions where escort fighters accompanied bomber formations toward the Japanese home islands, Japanese interceptor units quickly discovered that the bombers were no longer flying alone. As defending fighters climbed to engage, they were met by American fighters, already positioned above or around the bomber groups. Instead of encountering slow-moving bombers as the first point of contact, Japanese pilots suddenly found themselves facing fast, maneuverable fighters prepared specifically to intercept them. This forced Japanese pilots into air-to-air combat situations they had not expected during the initial phase of the interception. The result was confusion during several early engagements. The Japanese pilots who had been trained primarily to attack bomber formations now had to shift immediately into fighter-to-fighter combat at high altitude. Escort fighters could maneuver aggressively, intercept climbing aircraft, and disrupt attacks before Japanese pilots were able to approach the bombers. In some cases, American fighters were able to break up interception attempts before they fully developed, scattering defending aircraft and reducing the effectiveness of coordinated attacks against the bomber formations. Another factor that complicated the situation for Japanese defenders was altitude and speed. Many of the escort fighters accompanying the bombers were optimized for high-altitude performance. This allowed them to patrol above the bomber formations and dive onto intercepting aircraft when necessary. By attacking from higher altitude positions, they could use gravity to increase speed during engagement, creating advantages in energy and maneuverability during the opening moments of combat. Japanese pilots attempting to climb into position to attack bombers often found themselves vulnerable during this phase of the interception. These early encounters demonstrated that the defensive shield around bomber formations had become far stronger than before. Even when Japanese pilots succeeded in reaching the bombers, they now had to fight through escort fighters that were actively trying to disrupt their attacks. This additional layer of resistance reduced the effectiveness of interception efforts and forced Japanese air units to rethink how they would defend their skies. The arrival of long-range escort fighters over Tokyo did not end Japanese resistance, but it marked a turning point in the air war by altering the conditions under which those battles would now be fought. As American fighter escorts began appearing more frequently alongside bomber formations approaching Tokyo, the pressure on Japan's air defense network increased significantly. Japanese defense strategy had been built around interception timing and concentrated attacks on bomber formations. The system depended on early warning, rapid fighter launches, and coordinated interception patterns designed to overwhelm incoming bombers before they could reach their targets. However, once escort fighters became part of the equation, these carefully planned defensive routines started to face serious limitations. One of the first problems Japanese defenders encountered was the loss of initiative during interceptions. Previously, Japanese pilots could focus entirely on closing distance with bomber formations. Their strategy relied on climbing quickly, positioning themselves above or ahead of the bombers, and then diving through the formation to disrupt it. Escort fighters changed this dynamic. Instead of bombers being the first contact point, interceptors now had to engage fighter escorts before they could even approach the bombers. This forced defending pilots to split their attention between defending themselves and attempting to carry out their original mission. Another challenge involved aircraft performance at high altitude. Many American escort fighters were designed to operate efficiently at altitudes above 25,000 feet. This allowed them to maintain position above the bomber formations and respond quickly to interception attempts. Japanese aircraft, while highly maneuverable at lower altitudes, often faced performance limitations during sustained, high-altitude engagements. Climbing into these altitudes required time and fuel, and pilots who had just completed long climbs often found themselves immediately entering combat while still managing engine performance and fuel levels. The coordination also became more difficult as air battles grew more complex. Interceptor pilots had previously been able to concentrate their efforts directly on bomber formations. Now, with escort fighters actively maneuvering to disrupt attacks, engagements often broke into multiple smaller fights spread across the sky. Instead of one concentrated attack against bombers, pilots found themselves drawn into scattered dogfights with escort fighters, while the bombers continued toward their targets. At the same time, the overall scale of American air operations increased. Large bomber formations appeared more frequently, and the presence of escort fighters meant that defending forces had to commit additional aircraft simply to counter the escorts. This placed additional strain on Japan's already stretched air defense resources. Aircraft losses, pilot fatigue, and limited replacement capacity began to affect the ability of Japanese units to maintain consistent interception strength. The skies above Tokyo gradually became a far more contested environment than they had been earlier in the war. American bombers were no longer entering hostile airspace alone. Instead, they were accompanied by fighter escorts capable of actively engaging defenders. As this pattern repeated itself across multiple missions, Japan's defensive system increasingly struggled to adapt to the new conditions shaping the air battles over the home islands. As American fighters began appearing regularly alongside bomber formations approaching Tokyo, the strategic implications quickly became clear to both sides. The presence of escort fighters did more than simply protect bombers during individual missions. It changed the balance of air power over the Japanese homeland by allowing the United States to conduct sustained bombing operations with greater confidence and reduced risk. What had once been extremely dangerous missions for bomber crews gradually became more manageable as the protective fighter screen improved the survival chances of entire formations. For American planners, the success of the escort system opened new operational possibilities. With fighters capable of accompanying bombers deep into Japanese airspace, bombing missions could now be conducted with larger formations and greater frequency. Instead of sending limited groups of bombers hoping they could avoid concentrated interception, planners could organize large-scale operations, knowing that defending fighters would first have to contend with escort aircraft. This increased the pressure on Japan's defensive network and made it more difficult for Japanese air units to respond effectively to every incoming mission. The psychological effect of this change was also significant. Japanese pilots and air defense commanders had long operated under the assumption that distance provided a natural layer of protection for the home islands. The Pacific Ocean had acted as a strategic barrier throughout much of the war, limiting the number of aircraft that could reach Japan directly. The sudden and repeated appearance of American fighters over Tokyo demonstrated that this barrier had been effectively overcome. Enemy aircraft were now able to reach the capital region while maintaining the ability to fight and defend themselves in the air. From the American perspective, escort fighters also provided an opportunity to actively engage Japanese air defenses rather than simply avoiding them. Fighter pilots were not limited to protecting bomber formations. When opportunities arose, they could intercept climbing defenders, disrupt organized attacks, and force defending aircraft into disadvantageous positions before they could reach the bombers. This proactive role meant that escort fighters could shape the battle before the bombers were even directly threatened. Over time, the cumulative effect of these missions began to alter the overall air situation above Japan. Repeated encounters with escort fighters placed increasing pressure on Japanese interceptor units, both in terms of aircraft losses and operational strain. Defending pilots were forced to adapt to new patterns of combat that required them to engage capable fighter opponents before reaching their intended targets. As these engagements became more frequent, the balance of air combat around Tokyo slowly shifted toward the attacking forces. The skies over the Japanese capital had once been expected to remain largely beyond the reach of American fighters. But by the later stages of the war, that expectation had been replaced by a new reality, one where escort fighters could appear alongside bombers and directly challenge Japan's ability to defend its own airspace. The increasing presence of American fighters over Tokyo was not simply the result of tactical innovation. It was also closely tied to the enormous industrial capacity behind the Allied war effort. By the later years of World War II, the United States had developed an industrial system capable of producing aircraft, engines, and aviation equipment on a scale far beyond what Japan could match. This industrial advantage played a decisive role in sustaining the long-range air campaign that brought fighter escorts into the skies above the Japanese homeland. Factories across the United States were producing large numbers of bombers, fighters, engines, and spare parts simultaneously. Aircraft such as the B-29 Superfortress required extensive resources and specialized production facilities. Yet, the American industrial system was able to deliver these complex machines in significant quantities. At the same time, fighter production lines were producing aircraft capable of long-range escort missions, ensuring that bomber formations could be accompanied by protective fighter screens whenever needed. This level of production allowed American air forces to maintain operational momentum, even when aircraft were lost in combat or accidents. Replacement aircraft and trained crews could be deployed to forward bases across the Pacific with relative speed. As new airfields were built or captured on islands closer to Japan, these bases quickly filled with aircraft ready to support the expanding bombing campaign. The ability to reinforce units and maintain aircraft availability ensured that missions could continue without major interruptions. Logistics also played a critical role in sustaining these operations. Maintaining large numbers of aircraft on remote island bases required constant shipments of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and maintenance equipment. Supply convoys transported aviation fuel across thousands of miles of ocean, so that bombers and fighters could launch missions from bases in the Mariana Islands. Ground crews worked continuously to service aircraft between missions, preparing them for the long flights required to reach Japanese targets and return safely. As these systems came together, the scale of air operations over Japan increased dramatically. Bomber formations could be assembled in large numbers, escorted by fighters capable of protecting them throughout significant portions of the mission. With each new operation, the defensive burden placed on Japanese air forces grew heavier. Interceptor units had to respond not only to large bomber formations, but also to fighter escorts capable of engaging them in direct combat. But the expansion of this air campaign meant that the skies over Tokyo were no longer defended by distance alone. Instead, the defense of the Japanese capital had become a constant struggle against an opponent that possessed both technological capability and overwhelming industrial support. The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo symbolized this shift. They represented not just a tactical change in air combat, but the visible edge of a vast industrial and logistical system that was steadily projecting air power across the Pacific and into the heart of Japan's homeland defenses. By the final stages of the war, the appearance of American fighters over Tokyo had become a clear signal that the strategic situation around Japan had fundamentally changed. What had once been viewed as an almost unreachable homeland was now exposed to regular aerial operations conducted by bombers and their escorts. The Pacific Ocean, which had previously served as a natural barrier protecting Japan's major cities, no longer provided the same security. Once long-range aircraft and forward island bases made sustained missions possible. Japanese air defense forces continued to resist these operations, but the nature of the fight had shifted. Interceptors still launched to challenge incoming formations, yet they now faced a far more complex battlefield. Escort fighters forced defending pilots into engagements before they could reach bomber groups, breaking up coordinated interception attempts and reducing the effectiveness of attacks on the bombers themselves. Each mission demonstrated that American forces had developed a system capable of projecting air power directly into Japanese airspace. For the people living in Tokyo and other major cities, these air battles represented more than just military engagements in the sky. The growing frequency of bomber missions meant that air raid warnings, defensive preparations, and aerial combat became part of daily life. Aircraft formations appeared overhead more often, and the sound of engines and distant combat served as reminders that the war had reached the Japanese homeland in a way that had once seemed unlikely. From a strategic perspective, the ability to escort bombers with fighters contributed to the increasing pressure placed on Japan during the final phase of the conflict. Long-range missions could be conducted more consistently, and bomber formations had greater protection while approaching heavily defended areas. The presence of escort fighters made it more difficult for defending units to disrupt bombing runs, allowing American air forces to carry out their operations with increasing confidence. By this point in the war, the skies over Tokyo were no longer defined by the early expectations of safety created by distance. Instead, they had become part of a larger battlefield extending across the Pacific. The American fighters flying alongside bomber formations represented the final collapse of the belief that Japan's capital could remain shielded by geography alone. The arrival of those fighters marked more than a tactical milestone. It demonstrated that the balance of air power had shifted decisively. What Japanese pilots once dismissed as an unlikely threat, the idea that enemy fighters could regularly appear over Tokyo, had become a recurring reality, shaping the closing stages of the air war in the Pacific.